Good evening. Welcome to Hyde Park, and at Hyde Park tonight we feature the State Minister of Finance, Eran Wickramaratne. Good evening and a warm welcome.
Good evening.
Well, at Hyde Park, Minister, we'd like to discuss the oil pricing formula, which you and the Minister very elaborately explained this week. Let's start off with that. The maximum retail price equals to V1 plus V2 plus V3 plus V4. Of course, at the start of this week, it was explained by the Minister of Finance that this formula was quite confusing with so much of added components, but it seems very simple. Would you like to break it down for us?
Yeah, I think the first thing, if you just go behind the formula, why have a formula at all? Governments, right, have in the past, at least 70 years since independence, basically decided what the price is going to be. And the price is going to be what the government wants. And that's the price that people, citizens who come at the pump in a petrol station have to pay with its diesel, petrol or kerosene. So that's what is the method that has been used so far. Now, this is an attempt, right, to basically make it more scientific, the pricing more scientific, and to provide some kind of a basis for the pricing. So there are two choices. One is government decides it, or because it's a commodity where the price is largely internationally determined, that you link it to the international prices, and therefore the consumer makes a decision. Now, when the government decides what the price is, the government is deciding how much you are going to consume. Because if it increases it heavily, you will consume less, and vice versa is true. But if you let the price locally be linked to the price internationally, then the consumer is empowered, because the consumer will make a decision whether he wants to or she wants to consume more or less. So that's the other big logic behind having a formula for something like fuel. Fuel is not the only thing that you should be having a formula, but for something like fuel. So based on that principle, we went in the month of May and said we will have a fuel pricing formula. So when the Minister of Finance, Mangala Samaraweera, talked about the fuel pricing formula, he talked about four variables, major variables in the fuel pricing formula. And then each variable again gets broken down into other components, each variable. So the major variables are, one of that is the landed costs, right? And the landed costs includes the Singapore Platts. Now, it could have been Singapore, it could have been Dubai. Those are the two major places in which the price would be determined. So we've used Singapore Platts price per barrel. Then the average weighted premium for the barrel, and then loss due to evaporation, and then the exchange rate are applied. Then you have the processing cost. Now again, what was spoken in the media conference, without going into all the different details, is again there are two components, and we hadn't elaborated this, but you can elaborate on it. It depends whether you are bringing finished product or you are bringing crude. Then also the formula needs to take that into account, because processing costs will differ. So speaking more generally, the processing cost will include the port charges, transport costs, dealers' margins, right, including some loss of evaporation during the process to dealers, and the stock holding cost. And then crude and finished products will also differ, because the processing becomes then more elaborate if it is in the refinery process. So that cost needs to be taken in. And then you have the local administrative costs, right? And the administrative costs include personnel costs, depreciation, and other cost elements. I think as we, now that we have agreed as a government on the economic principles behind it, as we go forward, we can probably improve the formula, and we could have a lot more debate on the cost elements itself, is to see what elements are under our control and what elements are not under our control. And the elements under our control then come more and more into public scrutiny in terms of actually trying to see how it could be improved. And then the final component in that, if you just use it as V1, V2, V3, V4, the final component in that would be the taxation component. That is, government taxes. It's an import that's coming into the country, and in principle imports are largely taxed, and generally the relief is given more on the export side because you want to have a more favorable current account balance, so you want to encourage your exports. So you tax it, and then there are also various taxes. There are customs duties there, then there is an excise duty, then ports and airports, development levy, and there's a nation building tax, right? All are 1%, 2%, and so forth and so forth, and then customs duties and things that can be varied. So the taxation component, right, you can keep it fixed or you can vary the taxation component. So if a government decides to cushion an increase, let's say, this taxation component is where the government has a leeway in actually adjusting it.
So wouldn't you consider working out the taxation component, Minister? Because this is a common argument, very widely spoken about. Why would the government let fuel prices increase month after month on the 10th of each month? Why couldn't the taxes be reduced in that case?
Yeah, so if you ask the question about why should you be adjusting the fuel prices month after month, I would say that you should adjust the fuel prices daily, because every day there is an international price on fuel and you can adjust it daily. Now most countries, right, all countries in Europe, our biggest neighbor India also adjusts its fuel price every single day, right, every single day. They have a formula, and when those variables change, there are two main variables that change. One is the cost per barrel, right, and international prices, because that changes all the time. And if you use your Reuters screen even now, you will see, like exchange rates, the cost per, as it's being traded, the cost per barrel will be changing. So you see that. And then of course there are futures in it as well. Then if you take the other big variable is the exchange rate of a country. The exchange rate of a country also, in most countries, it's dynamic. So if you look at a Reuters screen, if you're in a bank, you walk into a bank, there's a dealing room in every single bank, and the dealer screens are on, you will see dealers are constantly watching the rates every moment. So you can actually adjust this every day. Those are the two main variables. But for reasons that really were given by the Ceylon Petroleum Corporation, was that they were still not ready, because you need the technology, i.e. the software, because if your retail stations are connected to your center electronically, then on one computer you can actually put the variables in and it will change it everywhere. So you have a specific time, maybe 12 midnight or something. So if you drive down the road, right, let's say in a highly competitive market, it can be in Europe, it can be in North America, one of those countries, you will see as you pass petrol station by petrol station, gas station by gas station, prices will slightly vary, because they know the international price and they will be competing with each other. But otherwise you can have a fixed price, like our MRP, but it's also market related.
Right.
So coming to the question you asked on taxation, we tax the fuel when you we approximately maybe 35% or whatever. There is a tax when you add all these taxes. Now if you look at taxation on fuel, virtually every country in the world I know has fuel taxation, every country, because basically this is an energy source that you are taking out of the earth and you are going to deplete it over time. So the principle is, right, you need to use it carefully, sparingly, and somebody should be making a decision, either the government or the citizens themselves should be making that decision. So that taxation is there. So what you do is, right, like if the other two variables, the exchange rate and the per barrel price, which is market driven, escalate a lot, then if you feel that you need to cushion, right, the price at the pump, you will reduce your taxation component. So that is the leeway that all governments generally have. That leeway is there. So it's something like this. Some people have asked me, why do you want to do that? I say it's something like this. You can either pass all of it to the consumer and then take the repercussions of it or the response of it. Or you can take the tax, and tax is also utilized by the state. And the state will then utilize the tax in other areas, right? Because that tax will then go into the social safety net, right? Social transfers. It will go into health, right? It will go into education. So it's like this, it's like the home budget, right? You have an income, and sometimes you have to decide where to basically put that income. And you will vary depending on what your socio-economic priorities are. So there are more political decisions, right? Socio-political decisions, right? Rather than just finance decisions. So you have to decide, well, if the safety net or if the elderly population are more important, you don't want to really cut the subsidies that are going down there. So economics is basically you are constantly balancing what you think the interests are in society.
How do you balance it out given the global economic situation? I mean, it's not getting any easier for the people across the globe with global tensions. And of course, we don't see oil prices easing either. And the rupee seems to be falling. This is, of course, something we see across other currencies too. But how would you look at mitigating the effects on everyday life here?
Yeah, so people don't like to say this, and politicians don't like to say it, that there are things you can do and there are things that are completely out of your control. Generally, you like to assume when you're a politician, minister, you're a government, right? Everything is in your control, and government is like God, there's no such thing, like individuals like us are limited, so are governments, because governments are a collection of individuals. So there are things that governments can do and things that governments can't do. So as you correctly said, right, the price of oil, of course, the international commodity, it's determined on the exchanges. Then if you take the exchange rate, right, there are two methods on the exchange rate too. In the past, some countries have tried to have a fixed exchange rate. So they artificially fix the exchange rate, and then you basically take the other consequences of a fixed exchange rate. Now, what are the consequences of a fixed exchange rate? One of the consequences of a fixed exchange rate is that your exports may not become competitive. Now, exports, right, whether the country can increase their exports, depends again on a whole lot of variables, but the exchange rate is one of those variables, but an important variable. So if you take Sri Lanka over a period of 15 years, going back, right, 15, 20 years, our exports out of this country, measured as a percentage of the gross domestic product, the GDP, was in its 30s, and it has come down to about 14, 15%, right, over a period of time, right. So one reason is, of course, we haven't had a competitive exchange rate. That's not the only reason. That's just one reason. So exchange rate needs to be constantly competitive. So we've taken a decision that the exchange rate needs to be competitive, and we have also very clear, absolutely clear, that Sri Lanka's future in terms of raising its living standards of its people will depend on our country's ability to raise exports and to sell beyond the 21 million people who live here. We need a much bigger market. We need a global market, we need an international market. And if you look at Asia, for example, as we know, in the last 20 years and probably in the next 30 years, this is going to be the growing market in the world, right? It's going to grow faster than the rest of the world. And we need to position ourselves as a small island with a small population, basically to increase our exports, right? So this is very, very critical that we understand this, because our future is going to be there. Just selling to our 21 million people is not going to raise our living standards. If we just look at our table here, right, our table here, you're beautifully dressed, right? You have a mic, this electronics that is there, the sound that is there is probably imported. I don't know too much about makeup, right? So I don't know whether makeup is largely imported or whatever, but I see advertisements on the street and it sounds like they're international brands. Mainly all of those are imported. We look at our iPhones, right, and the electronics we use, it looks like it's also imported. Right? Maybe the clothes are the things that probably we are wearing out of local manufacturing. Then the vehicles we drove into the studio. We look at all the equipment in the studio, it's imported. So we are globally integrated. Sri Lanka is globally integrated. So imports are a very important part of our living standards now. Right? Living standards don't go down. So what do? We need to take our local production and we need to sell it to a much bigger market than we have. So exports become key. So the exchange rate needs to reflect it, right? So the strength of an exchange rate in a country will depend on that country's reserves, foreign currency reserves. That also needs to be genuine reserves built out of exports increasing. That reserve needs to be basically built. So that's where we have decided that the exchange rate should be, right, more market reflective. In other words, don't artificially try to defend your exchange rate.
Right.
Now in 2012, the government tried to do that, right, artificially defend it, and we expended over a period of time about nearly $4 billion over a period of time. We are not going to do that now.
At Hyde Park, we're talking to the State Minister of Finance, Eran Wickramaratne. Minister, I think you were talking about how we should look at a manufacturing-led economy going forward. But what measures do you think, what serious measures has the government taken? Because we're still struggling to develop our export sector. And given the rupee depreciation, yes, the government says we will curb imports, but in order to curb imports, we need to have that the local matter sorted here in terms of manufacturing.
Yes, in Diwali there are a few things when it comes to actually becoming competitive. As I said, the exchange rate is only one component. So you're raising a valid question on what the rest are. Just to close the thing on the exchange rate, I would like to say that we have depreciated as of today, 21st October, right? I just got the statistics by about 11.9%, right? This is very high for us, right? India has, by today, it's become about 15%, right? And then we have Pakistan, which is at 21% depreciation, as opposed to our 11.9, 15, and 21. India and Pakistan, these are the largest neighbors around. And then the Chinese renminbi has gone by about 6.5%. So it's better than us. Indonesia is like us. It's in the 12% range. The currencies that have done better than us in Europe are the Singapore dollar, which is about 3%, and the Thai baht. So if you look at it as a whole, yes, we have depreciated, but then we are performing more strongly than some of the economies in Asia, particularly the larger economies in Asia. Some of the small economies have done well. I originally thought this was an Asian crisis. Then it began to look more like an emerging markets crisis. We know Turkey just fell off the screen at 50% depreciation. Argentina has fallen off the screen at more than 50% depreciation. But then more recently, we know that the Russian ruble has depreciated more than us. Then even the Australian dollar has been depreciating. So this is basically the response to, one is economic policy pursued by the Trump administration, then the jacking up of rates there and the flowing out of funds, capital out of emerging markets into the United States of America. The uncertainty that's coming out of the US-China trade disputes, some of the uncertainties that are now currently developing in the Middle East. In the last few days, oil prices, as you said, have been rising, and in the last few days it's kind of tapered down a little bit, but we don't know what's in it for us in the long term. So that's really on the exchange rate. But as your question suggests, is that there is more than the exchange rate in actually increasing your exports out there. So if we look at our leading exports, right, before I get into manufacturing, I might say something on agriculture as well. So we have services, manufacturing and agriculture. In the services area, which Sri Lanka has really zoomed ahead over the last 30 years or so, right, and we look at it, we have, even in the last year, exports have grown by 10.2%. Right, in the last year, the highest export number we have seen in historically, more than 11.3 billion exports, but then imports are 20 billion.
Right.
So the current account deficit remains. And then if we look at remittances, foreign remittances have been more or less stagnant, right? It hasn't been growing. And I think one of the challenges going into the future on this is that we need to upskill our labor force, right? I would say that what are Sri Lanka's unique selling propositions? In my mind, there are only two in this country, two major ones. And if we understand these two major unique selling propositions and just focus on it, we have fallen in the last 50 years to the bottom of the Asian table. We were only second to Japan in terms of per capita income at independence, and we have fallen to the bottom because of wrong economic policies being followed. So one unique selling proposition we have is our geographical positioning. We are an island, right, the southernmost part of the Indian Ocean, right? We are the gateway, right, to the east and the west, and also to the gateway to the South Asian subcontinent. We have friendly relationships, diplomatic relationships with virtually every country, including South Asia, right? Including South Asia, India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, all the big countries, right? We have a good relationship with China, which is the growing economic power in Asia. And our government in the last 3 years has strengthened our relationships with our traditional markets in the US and in Europe. We've got the fishing ban removed. Fishing exports have increased by more than 40% just last year. We've got the GSP Plus back. We haven't seen the full benefit of it. I think in 2018 we're going to see the full benefit of GSP Plus, and all that is to do with basically normalizing relationships. So in the language of the 1970s and 80s, pursuing, if you want, a non-aligned foreign policy is very important for us. So using these markets, so one of the things is creating a hub, a shipping hub, a logistical hub, even value-added manufacturing in Sri Lanka to serve this. So one of the ways we go about it is also creating the environment, and in creating that environment, we are creating FTAs. Now, the past government, the Chandrika Kumaratunga Bandaranayaka's presidency, created an FTA with India. There was a lot of opposition when that FTA was created. But what has it proved? It has proved that it was the correct decision that Madam Kumaratunga's government took when it took that decision.
Are you saying the Singapore Free Trade Agreement is also what Sri Lanka needs?
I'm saying not only that. I'm making a wider point here. We need a lot more than that. So the FTA she created, right? India anyway exports to Sri Lanka. China anyway will export to Sri Lanka because they have lower cost bases, and we are going to take Chinese and Indian products anyway. They don't need an FTA for it. But for us to get our exports into those markets, we need an FTA. And if you look at the Indian FTA closely, I know that some of my friends in the business circle who have had some issues exporting into India sometimes overlook this point. But if you look at the statistics, our exports to India have grown. Yes, there are non-tariff barrier issues with India, and we are constantly in discussion with the Indian government, and we need to resolve it. So we have that. We are trying to expand the FTA with India. We have an FTA with Pakistan. I can't say that it's been a great success, but we have to work on it. We have now an FTA with Singapore. We are in discussion with China and with Thailand. Bangladesh has shown an interest. So this is about creating the environment for exports, because if Sri Lanka is going to use its location as very important. The second, you don't mind me calling you Indi, right? The second thing is is our unique selling proposition is our people. If you only have 21 million people, just the size of a city in India and China, we must invest in our people. Right? When I go around this country, most places, right, people think that development is having a concrete road or a tarred road or some physical infrastructure. This is where I differ. I don't say it's unimportant, but if you ask me the priority, I will say invest in the people. Because if we are really to benefit from this, right, all we can offer is, with such a limited population, is to have a highly skilled population so that we can go for the value-added products. This is where the investment is. As if you were to ask me any insights into the budget, or people are important, right? People are important.
So and you're hinting us that you would
we will invest. We will invest.
But so far the people do not feel that the government has invested in them, that the government has taken into account their grievances.
Yeah, it's like this, right? As I said, government can't do everything because governments are limited and government have limited resources. But if we are talking about utilizing limited resources in people, then I would say our government has already done that. There are two areas. One is education and one is health, right? Education and health. If you look, for a decade, the GDP spent on education and health has been coming down until 2015. What have we done since we took office? It hasn't increased by a lot because we have had lots of challenges. But we have arrested. It's not going down. It's slightly moving up. I would like to see it moving a lot more, and hopefully in this budget proposals also that it will move much higher. If you take health, for example, right, the quality of health, the number of hospitals that have been upgraded and built in these last 3 years. If you look at the Seneka-Bibile proposals, Professor Seneka-Bibile proposals, 30 years debate in Parliament, not implemented. We have implemented that. Even Maithripala Sirisena as a minister of health could not implement it. But Dr. Ada Derana as a minister of health has been able to implement it. What's the difference? Because the present way the government works is ministers have been given more power, unlike in the earlier period where even if the minister wanted it, he was blocked. And health is a good example. If you look at the prices of drugs in India, I mean, I have lists which I don't want to taking time reading those lists out here, I have them, right, massively brought down. I can't even believe that you could bring the prices of drugs down, because if you take cholesterol, the main things, you take diabetes, right, you take pressure, the cost of drugs have come down drastically, right? They've come down, like 100 rupee drug is going at 22 rupees, and I have the total list here, which I can read out, right? Prices of drugs have come. Earlier, if you were a cancer patient and you went into a government facility, there was a maximum limit had been put, 1.5 million. We have removed the limit. If you are trying to put lenses into your, for cataracts or whatever, prices have been brought down depending on the brand between 37% and 75%. Prices have been brought down. So in health we have done. In education, we have invested, but we need to invest a lot more. But my point is this, Indi, I don't think it's the government can do this. Around the world, the health and education needs, if you talk about Europe, if you talk about North America, if you talk about Southeast Asia, around the world, these are huge, huge demands and needs for it. Governments alone can't do it, but we need to create the environment. What our students need, right, every student on this education point is a higher education. So some will go O-level, A-level, university, right? 350,000 sit the A-level exam, 30,000 end up in the Sri Lankan universities. Another 100,000 qualify for the Sri Lankan universities but have no opportunity. So we have to come up with ways and means they get an opportunity. In the last budget, Mangala Samaravira introduced a scheme where a person like that who hasn't been able to enter a Sri Lankan university could take a loan, and they don't have to pay. There's a grace period after you complete it, and when you start working that you paid. We launched it in the last budget. These are things we have to look at, really expanding education, giving every child, if they don't go the university route, give every child an opportunity to get a skill, because even if they go into the Middle East, they can do more.
Right, you were talking about creating the right environment in education, but I'd also like to talk about investments here. Minister, I think what's really happening with the BOC, BOI and People's Bank? A former banker you are. We're not really sending the right signals to our investors outside the country.
Yeah, I would say this, that the FDI that we have received is below our expectation, right? And that we really need to be doubling the FDI we have. But having said that, just in 2017, the FDI we received was the highest in history that this country has received. We got $1.9 billion in 2017. I expect that FDI to go up this year, breaking the $1.9 billion. I don't know the exact number, but maybe up to $2.5 billion. But I'm still saying that we should be receiving double that rather than what we are receiving. So a lot more needs to be done. Talking on the FDI, there are lots of things. Leave the global factors out of this. Take our local factors. We certainly have bottlenecks, right? The kind of bottlenecks that we have are mainly to do with things like registering a company. It was taking time. Now you can register it because we have put it online, and that you can do it. We had issues about approvals on factories, buildings, lands and all. If you take the Colombo municipality for example, you can track it now, right? They have put in systems to basically track it. But if you still take like land registering land, getting land and factories and all, there's an inordinate delay in it. And those processes need to be streamlined, and more work needs to be basically done in that area. If it comes to like movement, the banking system and all, we are basically on par. Globally, we are on par. So these issues are there. And now you talked about BOI and Bank of Ceylon and People's Bank in particular. The BOI, the president has made a request that he wanted some changes in the BOI board. And that what I understood from the media is that the board members have actually resigned. I don't know whether that's accurate or not, right? So if that's the case, the minister now can go ahead and propose new names, and maybe even some of those who are already on the board could be reappointed, because some of those on the board whom I personally know from my past banking background are professionals of very high caliber. So it's not just board members. As you know, in a bureaucracy there are lots of others, and you have to work to change and improve a situation. Right. On the Bank of Ceylon, on People's Bank board, I also read it in the newspaper, and it appeared to me from the newspaper that the president has made a request for these boards to resign. I don't know what the reason behind it is, right? What the reason behind it is, because my understanding was that actually some of these boards had vacancies, right? And that people actually needed to be appointed onto the board, particularly in Bank of Ceylon. That's what I heard even last night. So that new people will have to be appointed. So I think that discussion will probably happen today or tomorrow, and maybe new members will be appointed.
Minister, I think we were talking about our two state banks, and last week we had the president's media unit telling us that the boards were dissolved. The president had advised that the board of directors be dissolved, and of course the minister, the subject minister and other related ministries were of the view that the boards continued in operation unhindered. But what is this situation here? How can that happen with the executive telling us that the boards were to be dissolved and the minister saying no, the boards will continue in operation?
Yes, so as you said that it was the media unit, so I don't think that there was really a verbal statement from the president on it. But even if the president has an intention of looking at that, and improving the performance of the banks, which I think is a good intention to have, then I think the legal process will have to be followed. The two banks are under separate acts, right? They have their own act, and the legality is that those acts will have to be followed, and the process will have to be followed. This is the difference between the present and the past, right? In the past, what the previous government did, the government of the former President Mahinda Rajapaksa, who people forget was also the finance minister, held the position concurrently as finance minister of the country, which I think that no president should be doing, because I think it's a different subject and it should be probably given always to a different person to handle finance. But then in the past, presidency and the finance ministry ran together. And then what did they do, right? Not just state banks, right? Even if you take the private banks, right? And I'm personally aware of this because I happened to be at that time the chief executive officer director of one of the private banks, right? And there were several private banks. There are about 4, and I won't name the 4 banks. I mean, people probably know the 4 banks. The government bought into the shares of those banks. And then what did the government do? The government, right, of the day, right, the finance minister included, and including using the office of the former governor of the central bank. Unfortunately, I think the governor of the central bank should be independent in this role. And I must say today that we have created that independence between the present central bank and the present government and the Ministry of Finance. We respect their views. We may not always agree, but we have not ever used undue pressure on getting things done. So what did they do? They started to appoint directors to represent government shares in private banks. And then through that, right, basically control and manipulate private banks. Today in the finance ministry, we still have shares in these private banks, right? But we haven't used that power basically to coerce, control, right, and threaten private banks. We have left it up to them, and I am the state minister of the subject concerned, right, and we won't do that. If we have an issue with it, we will bring it up, we will discuss it, because we want the private sector to have that independence and the private sector to flourish. But this is the difference between the past and the present. Even our president, Maithripala Sirisena, right, and our prime minister will follow the legal process. There is no question about it. Statement can be made, intentions can be made known publicly, all that, but the process will be followed. In the past, that process was not followed, and this is a huge difference between the past and the present. So going forward, even on this issue, there will be a resolution, and the resolution will be done using the proper channels.
Right. I'd also like to divert our attention to government's policy on state entities. There's been a lot of controversy surrounding especially the present government's policy on state entities, but I'd specifically like to talk about the 2 state-owned hotels that are up for sale within the next 6 months in a bid to raise $500 million. There's accusation that this is not going to be done in a proper manner.
I think we are living in an era in which credibility of politicians is low. Credibility, and it's not in Sri Lanka, I mean, this is a phenomenon around the world. And with the rise of the social media and the internet, right, and a lot more scrutiny, a lot more information and all that, and then with citizens journalism as well, right, always doubting something that may have been done in good faith. So that is really the environment in which we are actually living. I must say that there is a lot of fake news around, and therefore citizens are unable to actually distinguish between what is actually the truth and what is the untruth. In the social media, I think it will take a while for that distinction to be made. But if you take the mainstream media, right, I'm more concerned. With the mainstream media, we can't have fake news. Because after all, governments have given the mainstream media a license, have given them a license to broadcast, right? And therefore there has to be an accountability. And on the mainstream media, right, with the right to information also being given to the media and to citizens, right, the accountability on the mainstream media must rise. I give you an example. Somebody gets up and says, and I saw recently people have mentioned my parliamentary colleagues, right? The Minister Malik Samaravikrama's name, the Minister Sujiva Senasinghe's name, and just said, you know, they have solicited this, that and the other. People who say such things publicly in mainstream media, I'm just using that example because the current example has been said about many other people, right? In the mainstream media, must be responsible and they must be able to prove that. Otherwise, in my view, to create a really just, equal, democratic society, right, there should be sanctions against it. Otherwise, it cannot be said. Because responsibilities have to work, at both ends responsibilities have to work, right. So, you put an advertisement in the paper and you talked about this current thing about the Hilton Hotel and the Hyatt Hotel. This is being done by the Ministry of Finance, right, and we are doing this completely transparently, right. We have gone ahead and we have advertised for this. This is not a new thing. This intention has been said in our policy statements long ago. These are not the only two institutions. We have named about 4 or 5 other institutions as well previously, and now these have been put. And basically, the initial step is an expression of interest. People have been told, express their interest. In fact, I also saw it because I am not involved in this on a day-to-day basis. Officials run these things. Minister Mangala Samaravira and I look at more the policy issues. Yesterday, I saw in the Sunday papers an advertisement saying expression of interest. Before the end of, I think, this month, you have to express your interest. This is not a bid or anything like that. This whole process, I estimated it 2 weeks ago when I was in London. The whole process will probably take about 6 months to do, but it will go stage by stage. So it will be expression of interest. Then after that, they will give information. Then an RFP will have to be basically called. Then there will be time for that. Then people will be selected based on committee structures. Then they will have to come and do their due diligence, and then the negotiations will commence. Then only that particular sale will happen. So I would say that certainly there are so many channels now in this country. If anybody feels that something, right, which is unfair is happening, right, they're certainly open to approach those channels and basically make their complaints.
How about Sri Lankan Airlines, Minister? I think this is a constant question with the requirement to restructure the state entity, our national carrier. Do we have any expression of interest to work with Sri Lankan Airlines?
No, Sri Lankan Airlines, we went through a process, right? We went through a process, we advertised the process, expressions of interest came, RFPs were out, right, the 8 initially, if I remember roughly, then about 5, then the RFPs came about 3 or something, then one party was selected, then they came into the final due diligence process and that party pulled out and that process came to an end. That process took a long time. I can't remember, maybe 1.5 years or whatever it took. So what has happened since then is a new board has been constituted and the new board has been given the same task. So clearly they can't go about it the same way because they will have to basically put forward a new structure for Sri Lankan Airlines. I think the government's aim is very clear. Our aim is, right, we want to reduce the losses on Sri Lankan Airlines. That's very, very clear. We want to have a national airline which is more economically and financially viable. Because on one hand, right, it's a political argument. The political argument is we want a national airline. That's a political argument. The issue is what's the cost of the national airline? How much are we willing to pay for the national airline? Because when it comes to these issues, that often these are clouded in political language, right? Language like, you know, if you are really a son of the soil, you know, you should be having your national airline, you should be backing it. I often wonder that those people who make such statements, when they are traveling, right, when they are going on holiday to Bangkok or to Tokyo, or to London or to New York or to, I don't know, to Disney or, you know, some European destination, whether actually they are flying Sri Lankan Airlines or they are looking for the best deal going. So sometimes this conflict is within us. At one moment we are saying, you know, some nationalistic story. At the other moment, when it comes to our personal decisions, Sri Lankan Airlines is not even in our mind. We go onto the internet or we contact our agent and we say, I want the best deal, get me the best seat at the best price for the best return. So that's why I said the answer is a political answer. The answer is if we want to nationally align, then we need to make sure that it is done at the best cost. So we are open as a government. The board is working on it, and they will call for expressions of interest, right, at some point in the future. Again, this is the second round, right, and there will be a new model on offer, and we are looking for good management, right, and we are looking for a partnership, government and private sector.
We've also heard about India's enthusiasm in being a part of Sri Lankan projects, and I think there's been a lot of debate in the media and also with the recent revelations of an Indian newspaper talking about a recent cabinet meeting in Sri Lanka. What are your views going forward in balancing these two superpowers, India and China?
Yeah. I think when it comes to foreign policy, right, we have had 500 years of colonial domination. And there is no way that we should leave any room for any foreign power to dominate our country. We should be very clear that our destiny must be decided by us, those who live here. We should be deciding our destiny. And therefore, our foreign policy will always be friendly towards the world. It should be non-aligned, not a part of any particular global power. And therefore, the geopolitics have to be managed in that way. When it comes to investment, we don't care what the color of the investment is, whether it is European, American, Asian, African. Basically, investment is investment. And within the framework of the law, we will welcome all these investments. And the recent issue that you referred to in Parliament, right, was to do with the Port of Colombo and with the terminals, right, transshipment terminals in the Port of Colombo. And again, I would like to say this, right, on that particular issue. The Chandrika Kumaratunga government decided to, give one terminal out, because SLPA had one terminal and the next terminal they wanted to give it out. So they came up with a model and they gave it out to local and international shipping interest. 85% owned by them, 15% owned by us. That terminal, SAGT, is one of the most efficient terminals by any standard. Right. Then the Mahinda Rajapaksa government, right, led by the president, gave the next terminal, CICT, to a Chinese company. Same model, 85% owned by them, 15% owned by us. And both these decisions have proved to be correct decisions taken by those governments. And I'm saying that despite being, right, a state minister of a United National Party-led government, that those decisions were taken by Sri Lanka Freedom Party-led governments. But if you talk about it financially and economically, those were good decisions. They have kept the Colombo port growing, and those terminals are efficient. They are efficient terminals. Now we have built an East terminal. Right? When you have an efficient model working, why do you want to question it? We should give the East terminal on the same basis. Right? We should give it. The investment could be Indian. The investment could be Japanese. That's fine.
Are we considering India?
Yeah, India and Japan should be considered. After all, we must not forget something in our own interest, that 2/3 of the transshipment out of the Colombo port is going to India. 2/3 of it. I mean, we need to think strategically. In economics, we need to be pragmatic. You see, lots of people want to be either completely socialist or others want to be capitalist in this. I think we should be pragmatic in economics. I'm a pragmatist. I believe in getting the best deal for the citizens of this country. If a model is working, a financial model is working, let that financial model work. Let's give it on the same basis. What should we be concentrating on it? For 6 months, the government has not taken a decision on it. Look at the opportunity cost of not taking that decision. Nobody is counting the opportunity cost. We should be building our next terminal, giving this out and building our next terminal. In our next terminal, my suggestion is this: give it to Sri Lankan interests, the next terminal. Sri Lankan private sector, Sri Lankan companies can bid, Go one step further, put it on the stock exchange, go one step further. Right, but don't delay these decisions.
Will we see anything happening without delay? Any work happening in terms of having an investor being involved?
There has already been a long delay. Already there has been a long delay on this. And therefore, I would say we mustn't forget that India is a big country next to us. They are our largest market. And India is building 2 super ports in the south of India. Right? And we need to always think about the competition. A day might come when we might regret our decisions if the transshipment doesn't come here but goes directly there. We have an opportunity, right, basically to be the Singapore of South Asia, particularly when it comes to port and so forth. So therefore, I'm saying is we shouldn't be delaying, we should be making these decisions, and economics should be based on pragmatism and building a future for all Sri Lankans.
Right, I think on that note, I'd like to wrap up Hyde Park this week. Thank you very much for your time here, Minister.
Thank you.
We had with us the State Minister of Finance, Eran Wickramaratne, joining us at Hyde Park. We'll see you again next Thursday at the same time. Good night.